Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. My guest for this episode is Katherine Lacefield, a trusted partner in the philanthropic space, leveraging over 20 years of experience empowering organizations and individuals to bring positive impact in their communities. She is the founder and head consultant at Just Because Consulting, bringing a wealth of insights to the table that I'm sure we will tap into today. Through her clients, volunteering, webinars, speaking gigs, articles, and her own podcast, the Just Because podcast, Katherine has helped hundreds of nonprofits get excited about fundraising again. And she has supported many nonprofits in establishing sustainable, that's key, funding plans from small groups, grassroots advocacy groups to large international organizations. Her expertise is in animal and environmental causes, or as she likes to call it, non-human philanthropy. I love that. Welcome, Katherine. Before we dive into things fundraising, would you tell us something about yourself personally?
Well, a lot of people don't realize that I actually have been living in Mexico for 3 years. And so that's been an interesting change. And I recently adopted a little street dog named Mr. Pickles that we found on the street, and we saved him. So those are two little things about me. I love animals and I live in Mexico.
I love that. And you're originally from Canada?
Yeah. So I'm from Montreal, and it's still most of my client work is still, I work with organizations mostly in Montreal, but also around the world. So very international.
Excellent. So let's talk about your take, the fundraising landscape. In some ways, recently has been different, but I think in many ways, a lot of the fundamentals still they apply more than ever. So where do you see nonprofits kind of struggle with making fundraising accessible, fun, sustainable?
I think a lot of organizations have been, unfortunately, lacking in diversifying their sources of revenue, and especially with what's happening right now in the granting space, and especially in the United States. It's very challenging when you're dependent on very few funders to fund your organization. As soon as one of them leaves, you're left with a big gap. And they haven't been investing in building these relationships, especially with individual donors that can create that long-term sustainability. So I've had so many clients where they're like, yeah, we had a big grant that covered the first 3 years of, let's say, our development or our program. And that's coming to an end next year. And we haven't worked on replacing that. So I'm like, okay, so we're starting from scratch again. So a lot of organizations tend to depend a lot on few donors, and then they find themselves with an emergency situation that could have easily been averted had they been slowly building up new donors and relationships with other people so that it's more sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, I'd love to dig to that a little, because I hear this term, it's important to diversify your revenue sources thrown around a lot. But I also see it go very wrong, like nonprofits spreading themselves way too thin across many different kinds. So I'd love to kind of go into this with you, because I heard you, and I think there's a huge difference between diversifying, meaning don't be dependent on grants, and diversifying, even within major gifts fundraising, just have more major donors,
Yes.
right? That is diversification. That is legitimate diversification. So can you just peel back some layers on this diversification and dependency issue?
Yes, for sure. So, like you said, this is Mr. Pickles, by the way. Okay, so like I was mentioning, and I completely agree with you. I think a lot of nonprofits, they end up doing like 4 fundraising events a year, plus an annual campaign, plus a mailing campaign, and a peer-to-peer, and then they do the major gifts. Like that's another ballgame. So like I'm not necessarily saying to diversify your types of strategies within the same like donor persona, but it's about making sure that your eggs are not all in the same basket. So let's say if you're going to be applying for grants, apply for as many grants as possible to have that diversity. If you're going to be doing a major gifts program, try to get as many major gifts as possible in your program, so that the same energy to steward them and to sustain them is put on more heads. Same thing with individuals. Like I think monthly giving is a strategy that is very underutilized and underpromoted for a lot of nonprofits, because that will assure you some form of stability. And if one of them leaves at $20 a month, that's not going to create a gap in your funding or in your budget. But if, of course, like all of them, because you're not stewarding them, leave, then you have another problem. But I feel that when I say diversification, it's not depending on one type of funding audience. So grants, corporates, individuals, and potentially government funding would be ideally having a bit of all 4 of those. That doesn't mean that you need to have, let's say in individual giving, you need to have 20 different forms of giving. But about diversifying your audience is a very important part of fundraising.
Yeah. And can we talk about like when people should, add another type? Because I see this a lot. They're like, we should diversify and we're going to start doing all 5 types like all at once. I'm like, you're not good at any of them.
Yeah, you have no experience
So,
yet.
How do people know like when they're good enough at one type to add to be diversifying? And if you have a opinion about what type of fundraising activity or audience folks should be focusing on first if they're not sure where to focus their efforts.
Yeah, that's a tough question, because I think it really depends on your organization's strength. So when it comes to your first question about when are you ready to ramp up, if we could say, is your first, let's say your target audience is grants, does that funding program have a system? Do you have is it easy to continue doing it, or are you still scrambling? If you're still scrambling with one, you don't have the capacity usually to do 2, unless you're like, oh, is this working? Are grants even working for us? Are we getting any traction? If you're not getting traction, then maybe it's not the right funding strategy for you. So I would say that there's a couple of criteria that you need to take into consideration. What is your current status with that campaign? Oh, we have templates. We have our calendar, we submit them regularly, we have grants coming in, we have our systems to keep stewardship alive. It's going well. Okay, cool. So then once that system is in place, you might have some time to incorporate another strategy as well. Now, when I say which strategy to adopt second or next, that really depends on your cause, what is the potential funding for that cause, and what the prospect list is. So whenever I do development plans, I always recommend doing some form of mini audit of what is the potential for each granting or each funding strategy. So do we have an email list of individuals? Do we have a social media following of individuals? No? Then good luck launching an individual donation campaign. Maybe you need to work on your communication strategies first and slowly build up an audience and then be able to ask them for money. But let's say if you have a cause that is a bit more, let's say, politically sensitive or a bit more difficult, then you might have a harder time getting companies behind you because it's a touchy subject and they don't necessarily want to position themselves. So I think it really depends on your current situation, what you have already as existing systems, who's already following you. And of course, it depends on your sector of work because they're all different.
Yeah. So tell us, as someone who focuses a lot on human-oriented nonprofits, and but I love animal and environment too, and certainly I've had clients in that space. But what do you see as the difference? What are your insights from having that focus on the animal and environment, non-human mission space?
Definitely. So there's three main things that I usually find are the biggest obstacles to fundraising for what I call the non-human space. Of course, they're all connected to humans, so can't disconnect it. But anyway, so number one is the definition of philanthropy itself. So especially when we're talking about institutionalized philanthropy, you're talking about grants, we're talking about government programs. Usually these systems are made to help humans first, because philanthropy, love of humans, literally what the word means, kind of excludes the non-human world in many ways. That is slowly changing with climate change and a lot of the education and awareness we've been building over the last 50 years. But it still remains a very human-centered, anthropocentric institution. So philanthropy doesn't support a lot of animal causes. Environment is starting, especially in the last 10 years, I would say there has been an evolution, but I wouldn't say that there's like a huge environment sector or animal sector. From a percentage perspective, I think it's something like 3% of all donations. This is both, I think the statistic is equal for 3 or 4% for Canada and the US goes towards environment and animals combined. So it's a very, it's a very small percentage. So I think the definition of what is considered philanthropic or what is considered charitable does impede a lot of the animal welfare or animal rights and environmental protection causes. So that's one part. We're in a transition where these are becoming topics of interest. And to a certain degree, I can totally understand, like, putting humans first is not necessarily selfish. It's I think it's a biological normality where as a species, we'll be protecting our species first. I think that is to a certain degree something that if my child is sick, that is my current priority much more than climate change. Like, I get that. I understand.
Right.
But as we know, climate change will eventually impact our species greatly. Pollution, pesticides, and all of these issues that are considered environmental do have a huge impact on humans. So that's number one. Number two, there is some legal issues around lobbying for environmental issues or animal rights issues where you tend to go into conflict with human activities. So you're kind of lobbying against things that are illegal. So you're not trying to protect or defend the laws, and that can come into conflict with a lot of charitable activities where you're lobbying against what's the best interest of humans. So once again, that human, non-human conflict can come up where you kind of have more things to push against. And a lot of these industries end up having huge lobby groups, right?
I have a question related to that, and this may be out of your zone, but it strikes me, here where I'm in the US, you're from Canada, you're in Mexico, but here in the US, and I think in Canada, there's a lot of focus on protecting people. But I'll never forget, I spent a semester going to school in Tanzania in East Africa, and they had challenges where, the Western world, the colonizing world cared a lot about the environment compared to how much they cared about the people. Yeah. And there were where some of these incredible national parks were established in East Africa had completely displaced people and their food sources and their ability to just provide for themselves as they had for a long time. So do you see that? Is that something you've had experience with where it depends where you are in the world? Yeah. How much people are prioritized versus
100%
planet and animals? Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And this was actually, I did a project in university as well on, he was in New Guinea. Anyways, we have these same situations. This is not from a research perspective, but from what I've been observing for years is that our idea of what needs to be protected in nature is generally not what's in our backyard. It tends to be this exotic place that we want to protect, and that in our, from our external perspective, that place is untouched and it needs to be protected. But it's not untouched. There's people living there. There's indigenous groups living in a lot of these areas, and that has been dealing with human influence for decades, if not millennia. But we have this.
It's like when we say indigenous groups are untouched. I'm like, no, they've been alive the whole time, right?
They're there. There's no more untouched anything. We're influencing everything. Plastic is everywhere. Just with that, we're screwed everything up. Anyway, so I completely agree that I think when we're talking about international development, there are some SDG goals where they're trying to integrate a lot of these different causes together. But yes, and that becomes a big challenge where I think it's more of a and situation than an or situation, that we shouldn't be saying, oh, let's protect either of the environment or the people. What we should be saying, okay, how can we combine the two to make it so, let's say even in the case of this national park that you mentioned, what if we ask the local people that were living there to become the stewards of this national park? Why don't we hire them to take care of their area, the place that they know, which will also help develop their communities, bring wealth, maybe bring healthcare, bring education to these communities, while also protecting the space and creating more of a win-win situation for both. So completely agree. Do I think that that is starting to change? I hope so. The whole concept of One Health, I think, is really becoming more strong, more prominent in the philanthropic space. So I think people are starting to see these connections. But, with everything that's happening in the States around not funding international development and not funding a lot of other things, I think that there's going to be a big re-questioning of what can be funded and what cannot, at least on the government level. Hopefully philanthropy will not follow suit.
Hopefully. So how do you kind of bridge this gap? How do you evolve that narrative, that storytelling for organizations whose primary mission is animals or the environment? How do you weave in the human importance, or how do you help them stand out and get some more funding?
I think that depending on the organization, depending on their mission, they might also already have some internal storytelling. So let's say an animal shelter, instead of just focusing on the story of the animal that went through hardship, had difficulties, and now suddenly he's in a loving home, and where like the family and the adoptive family kind of don't exist in the story, we can share stories of how, for example, even from the person abandoning perspective, like some of it's going through like I've had stories when working in the shelter where someone was dealing with like stage 4 cancer. And she's like, I don't have anyone in my family that can take care of this animal, but I don't want to like just give him to anybody. And I trust you, the shelter, to find them a home. Sharing those stories where you're helping this person rehome their animal in a very difficult situation. And more shelters are being like, okay, what if we like temporarily foster this animal for someone, let's say, going through a less terminal illness that needs 6 months to just find their feet again. Those stories of how they've helped people keep families together, including their pets, those are so inspiring because people are like, I've been through difficulty. Like, I've had times where I'm like, how am I going to pay the vet bills for my pet? People can really empathize because at the end of the day, even if a lot of animal people are like, I need humans, very common sentence, unfortunately, in that space. Humans are your volunteers. Humans are your foster families. Humans are your donors. Humans are your employees. Humans are the people that are going to be bringing your organization forward. So we have to include the human element in how, by protecting animals, we're also helping the families that are taking care of them. We're helping build that compassion and that human animal bond that is so strong and that I think has huge benefits for humans, including mental health and, like just that emotional support can be really, really helpful for a lot of families. So those are different ways that I think that nonprofits that work in the animal or environmental space, there's parallels.
Really. It makes so much sense. And I'm just thinking of a personal story that last February, I adopted a puppy from a local shelter. I wasn't intending originally to adopt a puppy, but for my son, who's on the autism spectrum and has other diagnoses, and he was really needing that kind of support. He loves animals, and at his dad's, we had another dog who was going to be passing away. She's now gone, but she's 17. So, wow. We knew her time was limited. So, but interestingly, I have had almost zero communication from the shelter since I adopted. Meanwhile, my son routinely says, like, can we go back and visit, and will they remember me?
Oh my God.
And if I'd had any sort of connection or invitation, I'd be back there with my, amazing 12-year-old son and our wonderful dog and lots of stories that they could use. But because they haven't reached out, my kind of answer to my son is like, that's not really what their hours are for. It might be awkward. I don't know if they'll remember like the day we visited, right? Like, but for him, our story of adoption is epic. And so,
It
I was
is,
just
and it
so,
should be
right?
shared.
So, and I think it's so on the flip side, I hear people who need to fundraise, nonprofit folks feel like, oh, well, we don't want to intrude. Meanwhile, I feel like I'd be intruding if I went for a visit to say, like, to show them. My son wants to show them, like, how wonderful things have worked out. And it's just an invitation away. It'd be as simple as a letter or an email saying, hey, if you'd like to visit, we'd love to see you. Capture your story.
I think that this is an issue that goes beyond the nonprofit sector. Generally, our communication has broken down. I'm not saying I blame it entirely on social media, but texting, this more in personal communication strategies that we have nowadays, like it's almost like we feel bad calling people, like even like our friends and family, like, oh, but what if I'm bothering them? What if it's not a good time? Well, they're going to tell you it's not a good time, and you hang up and you call them back later. Like we put ourselves a lot of limitations around communications, and this is not just in fundraising. I think it just goes so further beyond that. And I think a lot of nonprofits are missing out on so many of these amazing opportunities to connect with their, because like I can just imagine you have this amazing story to share. As the shelter, I reach out, hey, you just like, it could be an automated email that's sent out 2 months after the adoption, whatever. It says, hey,
Right.
how's it been going? Like, we'd love to hear your story and see some photos of your adopted dog. And then you'd be like, oh my God, amazing. And you'd send out this amazing story, maybe a video, whatever it may be. That communication, that connection can be built. And then from a fundraising perspective, I'm just thinking, how much more likely would you be to become a donor? And like, we would love to help you. You guys can become like the ambassadors of our zoo therapy program or whatever it may be. Well, you have to build that connection first.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
There's so much missed opportunities, and I get it. Very low capacity, they don't have the people to invest in that storytelling. People don't necessarily know how to do it. They don't know what tools exist to make it an automated process. So there's a lot of education that is lacking in that community storytelling piece. But that's such a true story. I really hope I would encourage you to reach out to them and be like, hey, here's my story. My son would love to come by and show you, like, from having worked in a shelter, I've had people come back with the pets that I had seen when they were 6 months that I was taking care of. And I was like, oh my God, the transformation is amazing. You'll definitely have people that will remember. And if not, they will definitely be happy to see positive stories, because oftentimes we're so bogged down by all the negative ones.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could see that actually, when we were there, originally I was like, we're going to adopt an older dog. But we were looking at a dog who had trouble finding a home and had some behavior issues. And I was really surprised. The director came out and was very down and discouraging of us without knowing any information about us, partly, because I had a child, but I actually have a child who's like, he's on the spectrum. He's very in tune with animals and understands anxiety like deeply. And we were potentially a good fit for that animal. And I could just see in this person who came out that they'd had a lot of bad experiences, and that they didn't take the time to ask, what we were considering, what we were capable of.
And why are you interested in that animal? Or like,
yeah, why would we be interested in an animal who actually, who had some similar issues to my child, right?
Like, perfect match.
It's potentially a perfect match, because I think a lot of people misunderstand, dog behavior that looks aggressive, but it's really fear-based. And I was in that very similar situation with my son in public school. People kept misinterpreting his behavior as aggressive, but it was really a fear-based response. And he knew that, and I knew that. So anyway, it was just but you could see that those pain cycles just became an uncomfortable experience for us in adopting. And it could have been a growing opportunity for everybody.
And if I heard these kinds of stories, and like myself having done adoptions for years, like I remember one situation where there was this dog that I think he had severe food possession, like biting, dangerous, or anyways, not recommended for young children because of this. Like this was written on the file, and as most adoption counselors, we would be told like anyone with a child, like no. And that was just, it was across the board. There wasn't conversations and stuff because it was like, if the dog bites the child, then we could be liable, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some situations where I understand. But then what was really strange is that you have situations, the opposite of you, where the person, it was a father who had filled out the form, I want that dog. And we're like, I'm sorry, he can't be adopted out with young children. He's like, well, I'll come back tomorrow. I'll refill out the form and say I have no children this time and to get the dog. And we were like, so you would put your child at potential risk because you want this dog? Like, there's some messed up people out there. So I understand, but I think having a conversation and even like not being judgmental, like, okay, so why do you want this dog so much? Like what attracts you so much to this dog? Do you understand that we would be, having the pause to have compassion and still have those conversations is necessary, but sometimes it's exhausting. It can be really exhausting to have to always be there and be patient. Sometimes it can be very tiring, but that's not an excuse. Like, I'm not saying I'm excusing the behavior, but sometimes there's just been a big break of trust for a lot of these people working in animal shelters where people are like, yeah, we're going to do this. And the animal comes back a couple months later, obviously neglected. And you're just like, ugh. It's so disappointing. But I still have faith in humans, surprisingly. And so I think that we still need to have more conversations. We need to also trust people, because if they were giving you those vibes, then you would have probably been more on the defensive. And that doesn't lead to a good conversation.
No, it doesn't. And actually, the person who was working with us was having that conversation. And then this other person just came in and was like, you should never consider, like, I can't believe you're even like meeting this animal for the first time. I'm like, we're just meeting them, right? To see if there's a connection. It was very bizarre. So, but I feel like, there's this theme forming here of meaningful communication is important. Yes. Communication is important. And it's almost like sometimes we've had so much communication, it's like we're desensitized to doing it right. So before we run out of time, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, how do nonprofits make communication meaningful and make it fun and make it sustainable for themselves? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as much as like mass communications are great, so, you need to communicate with your donors. I guess I get it that it's easier to send out these mass emails to everyone and, post on social media. But I think that there's a couple tweaks that you can make even to those mass emails to make it more authentic, of asking people what they think, asking people for advice, like share your story. What's the weirdest dog you've ever, like weirdest name of a dog you've ever seen? Or what's the funniest cat name you've ever heard? Ask people to interact just so that they feel like it's not just one-sided of you giving information. There's more of a relationship building. So that can be relatively easily implemented, even if you have a low capacity. From a fundraising perspective, even if you send out your mass emails, you can personalize it with automated fields that makes people feel a bit more special. You can segment your donation list so that monthly donors feel like you're talking to them because you're saying, hey, thanks to your recurring gift. Things like that you can make little tweaks to personalize your communication so people feel more like you're talking to them. But one of the biggest tricks I recommend is taking half an hour a week, even if you 15 minutes, like at least half an hour, to try to send a random one-on-one email or write a letter to one of your maybe bigger donors. It doesn't have to be for Donor Recognition Week or for any special day. Just send them a thank you. And this is kind of like your husband or wife. Sometimes when they just randomly show up with a surprise, it feels so much more authentic. Like, I really was thinking of you, than when it's Valentine's Day or when it's your anniversary. It kind of has more of this, like, of course there's going to be something that happens and it feels more forced or obligated. But when it's random, I think that can really help build that one-on-one, like, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's have a coffee chat. Those kinds of one-on-one time, even if it's less of them, it's better to at least do something.
Great, great words of wisdom. I totally agree. So, for those folks listening going, yes, this makes so much sense, what kind of folks should be reaching out to you? And what's the best way for them to do that?
I usually work with small to medium nonprofits that don't have a huge fundraising strategy in place. I really like helping set up the system, set up the strategy for the next couple of years for them, or even I can also help actually do some fundraising with you. So small media, especially for in the animal and environmental space, that's really where I shine. And the best way to communicate with me is you can check out my website. So it's justbecaus.consulting, very simple. If not, I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me at Katherine Lacefield. I have McDonald and in parentheses, that's my maiden name. So definitely look me up and send me a message. As I just mentioned, I love having authentic conversations one-on-one with people. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Excellent. Wonderful. And we'll have those links in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much, Katherine. And thank you out there for tuning in and everything that you do to make our communities better for humans, for the environment, and for the animals that many of us love so much. Before you go, I have a small favor to ask. If you would take a moment to share this or another episode that you found helpful with a friend or colleague who you think could benefit from this or other conversations that we've had on this podcast. And remember, nonprofits are actually more complex than for-profits, so don't have any of that for-profit FOMO, and know that you can succeed by working smarter without also working harder. Until next time, take care of yourself.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.